Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we bring you the most incredible supernatural romance stories every single week. Today's story is one that I think is going to absolutely wreck you in the best possible way. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. There is a moment in every person's life when the world reveals that it has been lying to them. Not through a grand announcement or a dramatic unveiling, but through something small and impossible and quiet. Something that slips past every wall you have built around your understanding of reality and lands in the center of your chest like a stone dropped into still water. For Lena Ashford, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in the last week of autumn, when the frost had just begun to creep across the mountain grass, and the sky above the settlement of Iron Peak had turned the particular shade of silver gray that meant winter, was no longer a distant threat, but a presence already standing at the door. She was carrying a basket of dried herbs from the storage shed to the healer's cottage, doing the errand quietly and without complaint, as she did everything in her life. And the giant bear bowed before her in the middle of the public square, while the alpha king of all the northern territories stood 20 feet away with an expression on his face that she had never seen on any powerful man before. It was confusion. Pure, unguarded, almost childlike confusion. And somehow that expression on the face of the most feared man in the known shifter world was more frightening to Lena than anything she had ever encountered in her 23 years of living at the edge of everyone else's belonging. She had not meant to be in the square at that hour. The healer, old Marta Brennan with her gnarled hands and her perpetual smell of pine resin and something sweeter underneath, had asked her to fetch the dried winter bloom before the delegation arrived, specifically because she did not want Lena underfoot when the Alpha King rode in with his retinue. It was not said cruelly. Old Marta was perhaps the least cruel person in Iron Peak, which was not the same thing as saying she was kind, only that her indifference to Lena carried no malice in it, just the particular blindness of someone who had long ago categorized the girl as background detail. "Fetch the herbs and stay near the cottage," she had said, and Lena had understood perfectly well what was not being said beneath those words. Do not make yourself visible. Do not remind anyone that you exist. Do not give the important people any reason to notice you and find you wanting. Lena was very good at that. She had been practicing it for her entire life. She had been 4 years old when the Ashford pack found her on the mountain road, sitting in the mud beside the wreckage of a cart whose driver had long since fled or died. She had no memory of before. No name, no family, no clan markings, no scent of a pack on her skin. The Ashfords, a modest bear-shifter clan of perhaps 60 souls, had taken her in because Elder Ashford's wife, Doris, had a heart too large for the protocols of their kind, and because a human child alone on a mountain road in the first frost was a death sentence, and because nobody at the time had thought clearly enough about what it meant to bring a non-shifter into a shifter community in the long term. By the time they thought clearly about it, Lena was 8 and knew every face in the settlement by name and could bake the kind of flatbread that made Elder Ashford sigh with contentment, and Doris would have faced down the entire council rather than send her away. So she stayed, and she grew, and she learned, slowly and with increasing clarity, exactly what she was in this world. She was human in a community of shifters. She was without a beast, without a shift, without the golden warmth of a pack bond, threading through her chest the way she watched it thread through everyone around her. She could not hear the subharmonic communication that shifted communities used. She could not smell fear or intention, or the subtle territorial markers that kept the peace between neighboring clans. She healed at human speeds, which in a community of people who could close a gash overnight meant that her minor injuries became objects of concern and commentary, small constant reminders that she operated by different and lesser rules. She was not unkind, not stupid, not ugly, not without value. She worked harder than almost anyone in the settlement, learned the healer's craft with a dedication that impressed even Marta, kept the records and the stores and the correspondence with a meticulous care that the pack relied on without ever quite acknowledging it relied on. But she was not one of them. Not truly. and that fact sat in the center of every interaction she had like a stone under a rug, invisible, but felt with every step. The formal name for what she was in the social taxonomy of the shifter world was ward. It was a polite word. It meant protected but not belonging, sheltered but not claimed, fed but not family in the deeper sense that family meant among shifters. Ward. The word had always felt to Lena like a room with good furniture and no window. She had stopped flinching at it years ago. Flinching took energy she needed for other things. She was crossing the far edge of the square when she heard the horns. The Alpha King's arrival at any settlement in his territory was announced in the old way, with 3 long horn calls that cascaded down the mountain passes and arrived in the valley below as echoes of echoes, beautiful and severe. Iron Peak had known this visit was coming for 3 weeks, had spent those 3 weeks in a state of barely contained nervous preparation that manifested as excessive cleaning, repeated rearrangements of the meeting hall's furniture, and a low-level communal anxiety that Lena could read in every face she passed without needing any shifter sensitivity at all. The Alpha King came to every settlement in the Northern Territory once every 2 years, a tradition that had held for as long as anyone could remember, an inspection and a renewal of oaths that was technically a formality and practically a reminder of exactly where power resided in this world and who held it. Kalen Morrow had held it for over a century. He was old, as shifters measured age, old enough that the stories about him had stopped being gossip and become mythology even while he was still alive to contradict them. He had taken the northern throne at 40, which in bear shifter terms was still quite young, following a succession crisis that the settlement elders still referenced in lowered voices as simply the bad years. He had ended 3 territorial wars, consolidated 11 fractious clans under a single governing structure that somehow managed to leave each clan with enough autonomy that they didn't chafe their dignity raw against it, and had maintained a century of relative peace in a region that had previously known mostly conflict. He was, by any reasonable assessment, a very good king. He was also, by universal agreement, terrifying to be in the same room with. Not because of any particular cruelty, the older pack members had explained to Lena when she was young and full of questions. He was not known for cruelty. He was known for stillness, for the quality of his attention, which was the kind of attention that made you feel simultaneously seen completely and measured against a standard you couldn't quite identify. His bear was ancient, one of the great ancestral beasts, a creature whose line went back to the first age of shifters, and that age showed in him even in his human form. He moved like something that had learned patience as a survival trait over centuries. He was not warm. He was not cold. He was simply present, in a way that made everything around him feel slightly less substantial by comparison. Lena had been curious about him in the abstract way she was curious about many things she would never interact with directly. A category of the world. A weather system. A geological feature. She had not expected to be 3 steps into the square when his retinue rode through the main gate. She stopped. The sensible thing was to press back against the wall and wait for them to pass. To be as small and unmemorable as possible, which she was generally very good at. She shifted her basket to her other arm and stepped back toward the low stone wall that bordered the square's eastern edge, watching the procession with the careful peripheral attention she had developed over years of observing without appearing to observe. There were perhaps 30 riders in the retinue, all of them bearing the king's crest, all of them carrying that particular quality of controlled readiness that came with years of service to a powerful alpha. They rode in good order, horses calm despite the cold, and in the center of the formation, on a horse so dark it seemed to absorb the gray morning light rather than reflect it, was Kalen Morrow himself. She had seen painted likenesses of him in the settlement's administrative documents, the formal portraits required for official correspondence. They had not prepared her for the reality of him. He was large in the way that mattered beyond simple physical measurement. Large the way a storm front is large, the way a mountain range is large, a presence that reorganized the space around it simply by occupying that space. His hair was dark and shot through with silver at the temples, and he wore it without vanity, pushed back from a face that was all controlled angles and careful stillness. His eyes from this distance were the deep amber of old honey, and they swept the square with an automatic, habitual assessment that was clearly so practiced as to be unconscious. He was cataloging everything, filed it, moved on. His gaze passed over her, and she felt it like a hand drawn lightly across her arm. Brief, impersonal, gone, and then his bear emerged. She would later try to describe what happened to old Marta, who had watched from the cottage doorway, and she would struggle to find language adequate to it. It was not a full shift. He did not become the bear in the middle of the square in front of the settlement. It was more like the bear pushed forward through him, like something enormous pressing itself against a thin curtain, and for a moment she could see both simultaneously, the man on the horse, perfectly still, and behind him or beneath him, or through him, something vast and dark and ancient that had been sleeping for a very long time and had just, in some fundamental way, woken up. The horse stopped. She had not seen Kaelin give it any signal. It simply stopped as if it had encountered a wall. The bear, the great ancestral beast that was said to be large enough to block a mountain pass, that was said to have walked the world when it was still being formed, that had not shown submission to any living being in 500 years of recorded shifter history, lowered its enormous head, not in the symbolic internal way of a beast acknowledging its human's will. It bowed. The motion translated through Kaelin's body so completely that the man himself sat differently on the horse, differently enough that the nearest members of his retinue visibly startled, hands going to weapons before confusion stopped them. The Alpha King sat there in his saddle with his ancient, unconquerable bear pressed low in a gesture of absolute deference, and his amber eyes found Lena Ashford standing at the edge of the square, with a basket of dried herbs over her arm, and for the first time in perhaps a century, Kaelin Morrow looked completely and utterly lost. Lena looked back at him. She looked at the bear she could somehow see, without being able to fully explain how she was seeing it. She looked at the 30 armed riders who were staring at her with varying degrees of shock and wariness. She looked at the assembled Iron Peak settlement members who had gathered to welcome their king, and were now frozen in a silence so complete she could hear the wind moving through the pine trees on the ridge above them. She said, carefully and in the most neutral voice she possessed, "I think there's been some kind of mistake." And Kaelin Morrow, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, who had not been surprised by anything in living memory, said in a voice like distant thunder, "Yes, I believe there has, though I am not yet certain who made it. Now, if you are already gripped by this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And I promise this story has only just begun. The hours that followed the incident in the square were among the most uncomfortable of Lena's life, and her life had contained a considerable number of uncomfortable hours, so that was genuinely saying something. Elder Ashford, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s named Gerald, who had the perpetual expression of someone doing complex arithmetic in his head, had materialized at her side within 40 seconds of the incident, taken her firmly by the elbow, and guided her toward the meeting hall with the speed and intent of someone removing a piece of furniture that had been placed incorrectly before an important guest arrived. He had not been unkind about it. He had also not spoken to her directly until they were inside, and the door was closed, at which point he had stood very still for a long moment and then said, "What did you do?" "I was carrying herbs," Lena said. "What did you do to the king's bear?" "Nothing," she said, because it was true. "I was standing there. I was trying not to be noticed. The bear, it just—" She stopped. "I don't know what it did. I don't know why." Gerald looked at her, with an expression that was equal parts frustration and something she recognized after a moment as fear. Not fear of her exactly. Fear of what her involvement might mean for the settlement, for the careful balance of position and deference, and managed expectation that kept Iron Peak in reasonable standing with the crown. She had, without intending to or understanding how, introduced an unpredictable variable into a system that ran on predictability, and Gerald was a man who understood with his whole body how dangerous unpredictable variables could be when kings were involved. "Stay here," he said, Do not speak to anyone. Do not go near the king or any of his people. I will try to manage this." She sat in the meeting hall for 2 hours. She could hear the settlement outside continuing its welcome protocols, the formal greetings, the ceremonial exchange of gifts, the tour of the new grain stores that had been built since the last inspection. She could hear it all and be part of none of it, which was familiar enough that she settled into it without too much distress. She reorganized the dried herbs in her basket. She straightened the stack of papers on the meeting hall's long table that had been prepared for the administrative review portion of the visit. She noticed that the 3rd page of the timber right summary had a transposition error, and corrected it with the pen that was sitting in the inkwell, because leaving a numerical error in a document to be reviewed by the alpha king seemed like exactly the kind of small, preventable problem that could compound into a larger one. She was staring at the window and the gray sky beyond it, and trying not to think too hard about the bear, when the door opened and Kalen Morrow walked in. He was alone. Or rather, he was without visible escort. There were almost certainly people stationed outside the door. He was still in his riding clothes, and he moved through the door and into the room with the quiet, deliberate intention of a man who had decided on a course of action and was proceeding with it. And he looked at her across the length of the meeting table with those amber eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She stood, instinct and habit. You stood when authority entered a room. He looked at the chair she had just vacated and said, "Sit down." She sat. He did not. He moved to the end of the table and stood there, and she had the curious sensation that he was keeping the length of the table between them not out of any social protocol, but out of some kind of deliberate restraint, as though proximity was a variable he was managing carefully. "Your name," he said. "Lena. Lena Ashford. You are Gerald Ashford's ward." "Yes." "You are human." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. His amber eyes moved over her face with that cataloging quality she had noticed before, but it was different now. Less automatic, more intent. She had the peculiar feeling of being read, the way you read text you cannot quite make out, leaning closer, trying different angles of light. "My bear," he said, and then stopped. The stopping was interesting. She got the impression that he had been about to say something direct and had, at the last moment, decided that directness on this subject felt somehow dangerous. He tried again. "What my bear did in the square, I need you to understand that this has not happened before. I understood that from the faces of your riders," she said, and then caught herself because she was not in the habit of making observations like that to powerful people. She was in the habit of saying as little as possible and letting powerful people project whatever narrative they preferred. "I'm sorry. I only meant that they seemed surprised." Something crossed his face that might, on a less controlled face, have been the beginning of amusement. It came and went so quickly she might have imagined it. They were surprised. "I was surprised. I am not accustomed to being surprised." He looked at the table for a moment, and she had the strange impression that he was having a conversation with something inside himself, consulting a voice that was not his own, and yet was entirely his. "My bear has been with me for over a century. In that time it has never voluntarily acknowledged another being as anything other than lesser or equal to itself. What it did in the square was not a recognition of equality." "What was it?" she asked, because she genuinely needed to understand, and the usual rules of staying small and unasking seemed insufficient for the situation she was currently in. He looked at her again, and this time the amber gaze had a quality she couldn't name, something that sat between discomfort and a very old, very deep longing, the look of a person who has been thirsty for so long they have half forgotten what not being thirsty feels like, and who has just caught the smell of water. "I don't know," he said. "That is what I intend to find out. The investigation, for that was what it became, began that evening and unfolded over the 3 days of the Alpha King's scheduled visit to Iron Peak, in a way that kept Lena in a permanent state of low-level tension. She had no framework for processing. She had spent her life being largely invisible in Iron Peak. Now she was the object of constant, careful attention from the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, and the attention was not hostile, which somehow made it harder to manage than hostility would have. been. She knew how to manage hostility. She had no training at all in managing being genuinely interesting to someone who could have anything they decided to want. Kaylin asked questions. Not all of them to her directly. Many of them to Gerald, to Marta, to the other elders of the settlement. And the answers came back to Lena through the settlement's gossip network with the speed and accuracy of an institution that had been honing that particular skill for generations. He wanted to know how long she had been in the settlement. He wanted to know where she had been found, and under what circumstances. He wanted to know whether she had ever shown any unusual abilities, any sensitivity to shifters or shifting, any reaction to the pack bond. He wanted to know if anyone in the settlement had any information about her origins. The answers, as far as Lena could tell, were the same answers she had been given all her life. Found on the mountain road. No identifiable origin, no unusual abilities. Human in all observable respects. She had believed all of this completely for 23 years. She believed most of it still. And yet something had happened in the square that had no explanation inside the framework of those answers. And she lay awake on the first night of the king's visit, with the familiar beams of her small room's ceiling above her, and tried to build a version of the world that could contain both the answers she knew and the thing she had seen. The thing she had seen. She kept returning to it. The bear pressing through the man. The bow that was not a bow but a recognition. Something more ancient than behavior or protocol. Something that happened in the same register as heartbeats and the growth of bone. She did not have a name for what it had made her feel. It had not been fear. Not exactly. It had been more like the feeling of hearing a piece of music that you have never heard before, and yet which you know somehow, which lives in some part of your body that learned it before your conscious mind existed. Recognition without memory. Resonance without cause. She was in the healer's cottage the second morning, grinding dried witch root into the fine powder Marta used for inflammation, when Kaylin appeared in the doorway. Marta, to her credit, did not faint. She did go very still in the way that small prey animals go still when a large predator enters their field of awareness. And then she straightened her spine with visible effort and said, "Your Majesty," in the tone of a woman reminding herself of her dignity. "I'd like a few minutes with your assistant," he said, which was such a polite way of stating something that was clearly not a request that Marta simply nodded and found reasons to be on the other side of the cottage wall. He sat on the low stool that patients usually occupied and looked at the cluttered work table between them with an expression she was starting to recognize. The internal consultation. The being spoken to by something that did not use words. He was, she realized, even more unusual up close than she had understood from a distance. The silver in his dark hair caught the cottage's firelight and threw it back differently than ordinary silver should. His hands, resting on his knees, were the hands of a man who had done real physical work in his life and not stopped doing it despite having every reason to delegate. And there was something about the quality of his stillness that was not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of something that has been moving for a very long time and has learned to move so efficiently that the movement itself becomes invisible. "I'd like to try something," he said, "and I want your permission before I do." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "I want to let my bear come forward. Not a shift, just forward, the way it happened in the square, but deliberately this time, so we can both observe what occurs." He paused. "My bear is insistent. It has been insistent since yesterday morning in a way it has not been in decades, and I want to understand why. Does it usually need to be insistent to get your attention?" The almost amusement crossed his face again, more visible this time. "No. Usually it functions as my instinct, my second awareness. We are integrated. What I want and what it wants are generally the same. Yesterday, in the square, it acted without consulting me. That has not happened in over 80 years. What happened 80 years ago?" He was quiet for a moment. A threat to the territory. Something old and wrong that needed to be removed. "My bear acted faster than my judgment could." He looked at her. "You are not a threat to the territory. I'm glad you've ruled that out. This time the amusement reached his eyes. It changed his face in a way she was not prepared for, cracked open the careful stillness, and showed something behind it that was, surprisingly, quite warm. She filed that observation in the part of her mind that collected things she was not sure what to do with and kept herself neutral. "So," she said, "you want to bring the bear forward. What do I do?" "Nothing. Just sit there." A pause. "Try not to be afraid. My bear is ancient, and fear can read to it as a different kind of signal than I want to send right now. I'll do my best," she said, which was the honest answer. She watched him shift his attention inward, the slight unfocusing of his amber gaze that she had seen before. And then the bear came forward. It was different in the small cottage than it had been in the open square. In the square, she had perceived it as something vast pressing against a curtain. Here, in the close warm space with firelight and the smell of herbs and the low ceiling above them, it was like watching light change in a room when the sun moves. Everything the same, and yet completely altered. He was still sitting on the stool. He still looked like Kalen Morrow, Alpha King, controlled and precise and present. But the bear was there, layered over him or under him or simultaneous with him, and it was looking at her. She felt it again, that resonance, that not quite memory that lived in her chest rather than her mind. Something in her responded to the bear's presence the way a tuning fork responds to its frequency, a soundless, physical, involuntary vibration that she could feel from her sternum to the tips of her fingers. It was not frightening. She did not know how to describe what it was. Familiar, perhaps. Necessary. In some way she did not yet understand. Like breathing was necessary. Not because you had decided it was, but because your body had already committed to the arrangement. The bear's enormous head lowered. Again. The same gesture as in the square. But here it was more intimate, and more impossible, and more real. And she could see on Kalen's face that he felt it happening, and that it did not embarrass him this time. He looked instead more puzzled than ever, and underneath the puzzlement was something she could not name. A raw and careful quality, like someone touching a wound that is unexpectedly beginning to heal. "It knows you," he said, and his voice was different with the bear forward, lower and rougher, resonant in frequencies she could feel rather than hear. "It knows you in a way I don't have language for. It keeps using the word anchor, but that word isn't mine. That word is coming from it, from something older than my vocabulary." She stared at him. "Anchor, does that mean something to you?" "No," she said, and then, because honesty with this man felt strangely easier than she had expected it to, "but it doesn't not mean something either. I don't know how to explain that. I think," he said slowly, like a man building a sentence the way you build something structural, placing each component with care, "that I need to speak with my archive keeper." The archive keeper was a woman named Voss, who traveled with the retinue and was, as far as Lena could tell, the single most frightening person in the entire delegation, despite being 65 years old and slightly under 5 feet tall. She had the bearing of someone who had spent decades being underestimated by people who subsequently regretted it. And she looked at Lena when they were introduced with the focused intensity of someone reading a text that they had been searching for a very long time. "Say your name," Voss said immediately. "Lena Ashford." "Not that name." "Your original name. The one before." "I don't have one. I was found when I was 4. I don't remember anything from before." Voss looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at Kalen. Where was she found? The mountain road above Iron Peak, in late autumn, in the frost. Voss muttered something under her breath that was too low for Lena to catch, and turned to the large case of documents she traveled with. And for the next 2 hours, while Kalen sat at the far end of the small room with that inward quality of attention he was apparently capable of maintaining indefinitely, Voss tore through documents and records and cross-references with the focused violence of a woman who had been waiting for a specific puzzle piece to appear, and was now absolutely certain she had finally found it. She found what she was looking for, as the afternoon light was turning golden and beginning to lean toward dark. She spread 3 documents on the table. Old documents, old enough that their edges had the particular brown fragility of paper that had been preserved past the point. Paper was meant to exist, and she looked at Lena with an expression that was equal parts triumph and something quieter and more sorrowful. The look of someone confirming a loss that they had hoped might have been otherwise. "The somniari," she said. "Do you know that word?" Lena shook her head. "No, you wouldn't. They were erased very thoroughly." Voss sat down heavily and looked at the documents rather than at either of them. The somniari were a bloodline of human women. They appeared in the records first about 800 years ago, though they were certainly older than that. Their role in shifter society was specific and was considered, in the old understanding, sacred. The great ancestral beasts, the oldest shifter lineages, are not simply animals sharing a body with a human consciousness. They are separate beings, entities with their own ancient awareness, their own needs and pains and cycles. Over centuries of carrying that second consciousness, even the strongest host could begin to drift. The beast's age would begin to press against the human's coherence, and without something to anchor the beast separately, to give it a point of external orientation that was not the host's own mind, the integration would begin to fail. She paused. The somniari were that anchor. Human women with a particular quality of blood and spirit that the ancient beasts could orient to, could recognize as external and stable and safe. Each great beast had a corresponding somniari line, a specific bloodline, maintained across generations, that would produce a woman whose resonance matched the beast's. The firelight was very quiet in the room. Lena was aware of Kaylin on the other side of the table with a precision she had no previous experience of. A physical awareness that was not quite like anything she had felt before, as though her body had already processed the meaning of what Voss was saying, and had begun rearranging itself accordingly, finding his location in the room with the accuracy of a compass finding north. "What happened to them?" she asked. Voss's expression was the expression of someone delivering news that has been bad for a very long time. The noble houses happened to them. Specifically, the noble houses who had been waiting for an opportunity to consolidate power and had identified the relationship between the great beasts and their somniari as both politically inconvenient and strategically threatening. If the great beasts had an external anchor, they were to some degree dependent on their somniari. Dependent meant vulnerable. Vulnerable meant that someone who controlled the somniari, or who removed them, could destabilize the great beasts and the powerful shifter lines they represented. She touched the edge of one of the old documents, with something close to reverence. They called it the purification. The noble coalition framed it as a correction of an unhealthy dependency, an argument that the great beasts should be self-sufficient, that the reliance on human women was a contamination of the ancient blood. Over approximately 30 years, roughly 4 centuries ago, every known somniari lineage was eliminated. Some fled, or appeared to have fled, but no somniari has appeared in the records since then. She looked at Lena. Until now. The silence in the room was the particular silence of information too large to immediately process. The silence of a world being reordered around a new fact. Lena sat with it and felt the pieces assembling themselves against her will, because she had not asked for any of this, and her entire understanding of who and what she was had just been turned inside out, and she was not entirely sure she was breathing normally. She had not been abandoned on a mountain road. Or she had been. But the abandonment was not random, not careless. Someone had put her there. Someone had been running, and she had been. What they were carrying, and whatever they had been running from had caught them. She had a family she would never know, and a history she had never been told, and a purpose she had never been prepared for. And across the table from her, the man who was at the center of all of it was looking at her with that amber gaze and the weight of a century in it. And she could feel his bear the way you could feel a fire in a room where the fire was very large, and you were sitting very close to it. She could refuse, Kaylin said. Voss looked at him. She could. This is not a command or an expectation. He was speaking to Lena now, directly, without the slight formal distance he had used in the meeting hall. What I have just learned changes what I understand about my own situation, and I will be honest with you about that situation because you deserve honesty and not strategy. My bear has been losing coherence. slowly over the past few decades, slowly enough that I attributed it to age and did not investigate as I should have. There are days when keeping the integration stable requires more effort than it should, when the beast's awareness and my own feel less like one entity and more like two entities sharing a body against their will. I had begun to consider the possibility that I would eventually need to... He stopped, started again. There are stories, in the very old records, of great beasts whose integration failed completely, of the consequences of that failure. His jaw set. You owe me nothing. You owe my bear nothing. Whatever your bloodline means, it does not obligate you to apply it to my problem. I will not pretend the need does not exist, because I believe you have a right to know the truth of the situation you have been dropped into, but I will not use that need as leverage. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Gerald's hand on her elbow, steering her away. She thought about old Marta and her careful blindness. She thought about 23 years of being background detail, of being the ward, of fetching herbs and correcting transposition errors, and trying very hard to be useful enough to justify the space she occupied. She thought about the bear's bow in the square, and the resonance in her chest, and the word anchor, and how it had felt both completely foreign and completely correct in the way that the most important truths often did, the ones that had always been true, and were only now being articulated. You said your bear was losing coherence, she said. What does that feel like? For you? He was quiet for a moment, and she understood that she was asking him to be vulnerable in a way that the century had probably given him very little practice with. Like standing in water that keeps getting slightly deeper, he said at last, slowly enough that you can ignore it on most days, but it is never not there. She nodded. She did not say anything else immediately, because what she was considering was large, and she gave it the respect of actual consideration rather than impulse. Then she said, I want to understand what the anchor relationship would actually involve, practically. What it requires, what it costs, what the shape of it is. I want all of that information before I decide anything. That is completely reasonable, he said, and she thought she could hear relief in it, though he kept it very contained. Relief that she was not refusing outright, or perhaps relief at being dealt with honestly by someone who was not performing anything in either direction. Then, let's keep talking, she said, and reached for the oldest of the 3 documents on the table, the one with the softest edges and the most careful handwriting, and began to read. And if you are feeling the pull of this story the way I think you are, this is a perfect moment to drop a comment telling me what you think of Lena so far. I want to know if you saw this revelation coming or if it took you completely by surprise. Over the following days, Lena learned. She learned from Voss's documents, from the careful cramped writing of archivists who had been recording the impossible with the persistent specificity of people determined to make the impossible comprehensible. She learned that the Somniari relationship was not a bond in the way that the mating bond between shifters operated, not a biological override or an instinctive compulsion that would bypass her own will and preferences and replace them with something imposed from outside. It was more like resonance than possession, more like tuning than transformation. The great beast needed an external point of orientation, a consciousness that was present and stable, and whose particular quality of awareness matched the frequencies of the beast's own. In the old practice, the Somniari woman did not give anything up of herself. She simply was herself, with intention, in proximity to the beast. And the beast drew stability from that presence. The way you draw warmth from a fire you did not build and do not have to tend. The proximity requirement was variable, but real. In periods of stability, the anchor could be at a considerable distance, and the effect would hold. In periods of strain or crisis, the beast would need the anchor nearer. The relationship had historically been lifelong, built slowly, strengthened over time. The Somniari woman lived within the great beast's territory, had access to the great beast's resources and protections, was considered under the direct aegis of the ruling line, which in historical terms had meant considerable status and security. It had not historically been a romantic arrangement, Voss was careful to note, though in some recorded cases it had developed in that direction over time. That was not a requirement or an expectation. Lena read this and absorbed it and kept her expression neutral, which she was very good at. She also noticed and kept quiet about the fact that the proximity requirement explained something she had been trying not to acknowledge since the afternoon in the healer's cottage, that her awareness of exactly where Kaylin was, in any room they occupied or any building they were in, had not decreased since the bear's first full attention settled on her. If anything, it was sharpening, like a sense organ waking up from a long anesthesia and finding its edge again. She knew where he was, the way she knew where her own hands were, without looking, without thinking, as a piece of basic spatial information that her body simply maintained as a matter of course. She did not mention this to Voss. She mentioned it to herself, privately, with the careful neutrality of someone making a note of a fact whose implications they are not yet ready to fully process. The settlement's reaction to all of this was, predictably, complicated. Gerald Ashford spent 2 days in a state of barely managed anxiety that expressed itself as excessive organizational activity. He rearranged the meeting hall 3 times, conducted a completely unnecessary inventory of the winter stores, and called 2 separate elder meetings that accomplished nothing concrete but gave everyone somewhere to direct their nervous energy. His concern was not, Lena understood, malicious. It was the concern of a man who had spent his life managing the settlement's position in a hierarchy he had not designed and could not change, and who was now being asked to process the fact that the foundling he had sheltered for 2 decades was apparently a figure of ancient and significant power, which was the kind of information that rearranged every calculation he had ever made about her, and about what her presence in his settlement had meant and would mean going forward. The settlement members responded in a variety of ways that existed on a spectrum from awed to unsettled to, in a handful of cases, something that looked almost like guilt, the ones who had been most casually dismissive of her over the years seemed to find the king's attention toward her particularly difficult to process, and she observed this without judgment or satisfaction, understanding that what they were experiencing was the disorientation of having to update a long-held certainty, which was genuinely uncomfortable regardless of how the certainty had been arrived at. Marta, to Lena's considerable relief and gratitude, simply looked at her over the work table on the second morning and said, "Well, I always knew there was something particular about you. I just didn't know what it was." "That makes 2 of us," Lena said. "3, said Marta. The bear knew first. It was the most acknowledgement anyone in Iron Peak had given to the fact that Lena was something other than simply present and useful, and she carried it with her for the rest of the day in the private and careful way she carried most things that mattered. Kaylin himself was a more complex situation. He was, as she had assessed from the beginning, a man of extraordinary self-containment, the kind of containment that had been built over a very long time and served a very real function, and which she had no particular desire to disrupt, just because she found herself in an unusual and proximate relationship with the person inside it. He was also, she was discovering, considerably more than the sum of his public function. He was precise without being rigid, which was rarer than it sounded. He had a quality of listening that was not common in powerful people, a genuine listening that was not simply waiting for an opportunity to respond, but was actually taking in and processing and adjusting, and he had the good sense to ask questions when he didn't understand something rather than proceeding on assumptions. He was also, she noted, unfailingly consistent in the treatment of every person he spoke with, from the settlement elders to the youngest child who had somehow avoided the square-clearing protocols, and was now trailing the retinue with the calm confidence of someone who expected to be tolerated. He was the same with all of them. That consistency was not performance. It was character. She filed it. On the 3rd day, when the formal visit was nearing its end, and the question of what happened next was beginning to accumulate weight in the air between all parties, he came to find her in the small records room at the back of the meeting hall, where she had returned to her work, because the work still needed doing, and she found the familiar orderliness of it genuinely calming, in a situation that offered very little that was familiar or orderly. He looked at the papers she was reviewing and said, "You corrected the transposition error in the timber rights summary. It would have been embarrassing, she said. For Gerald, mostly. Yes. He sat down across the table, in the way he had in the healer's cottage, with the deliberate placement of someone managing their own presence carefully, and looked at her with the directness she was learning to expect from him. I need to return to the capital, he said. I have been away longer than I planned as it is, and there are things that require my presence. A pause. I also need to tell you what the shape of a decision looks like, so that you can make it with full information. If you are willing to come to the capital as my guest, Voss and I can continue the research properly. We can verify what we believe about your bloodline, test the anchor relationship in controlled conditions, and give you time and information to decide if this is something you want to continue. He held her gaze. If you decide it is not, I will accept that decision, and I will ensure that you are resettled with whatever resources would make your life better, because what you have carried without knowing it has been considerable, and you are owed something for that, regardless of what you choose going forward. She considered him across the table. The bear was present. She could feel it, always present now, a warmth at the edge of her awareness, like the glow of a fire, in a room just adjacent to the one you are sitting in. It was not pressing. It was not urging. It was simply there, steady and ancient and patient, in the way that something that has waited for centuries could afford to be patient. What happened to the people who destroyed the Somniari lines? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. Something that had the quality of judgment, being rendered, but not a new judgment, an old one being confirmed. Most of them are gone. The coalition that organized the purification collapsed within a generation of completing it. Some of what I inherited when I took the throne was the long consequence of that collapse. He paused. There are houses that still hold some of the philosophy, the argument that the great beasts should be self-sufficient. That dependency is weakness. They are a minority. They are not without influence. She understood what he was not saying, that bringing her to the capital, making her presence and her bloodline known to the court, would not be without political risk, for her and potentially for him, or at least for his management of the relationships between the crown and the families who had built their position on a version of history that her existence contradicted. But you would do it anyway, she said. I believe that restoring what was taken is more important than the political cost of the restoration, he said. I also believe that if I were not willing to take that position, I would not deserve the throne I am sitting on. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the word anchor. She thought about the resonance and the tuning fork and the fire in the adjacent room. She thought about 23 years of being a background detail in other people's stories, and the particular quality of discovering that you had, without knowing it, been a main character in a story, much older and larger than the one you had been living. I'll come to the capital, she said, as your guest, to learn. I'm not deciding anything else yet. That is all I am asking, he said. And then, after a moment, in a voice that was quieter and more unguarded than anything she had heard from him yet, thank you. Now, I need you to comment below and tell me, did you feel that shift between them? Because this is exactly what I love about these stories. Nobody is forcing anything. Nobody is rushing. And that, my friends, is everything. Stay right with us because we are barely halfway through. And this story is about to get considerably more complicated. The capital city of the Northern Territories was called Ashenvale, and it had been built over 400 years against the face of a mountain that was itself so large it had its own weather systems, its own internal ecosystem, its own patterns of cloud and wind that were distinct from the valley below. The city grew upward as much as outward, carved into stone and grown over with the particular gray-green lichen that only appeared in places of very old shifter occupation, living evidence of the centuries of accumulated presence. It was, Lena thought on her first morning looking out the window of the guest quarters she had been given, the most spectacular thing she had ever seen, and she had been looking at mountains her entire life. This was different. This was what a mountain looked like when it had been in conversation, with the people living against it for long enough that both parties had changed. Her quarters were in the east wing of the keep, which Voss explained was traditionally assigned to people in positions of unique status. Neither courtiers nor servants, neither officially part of the household nor housed externally. She had a sitting room and a study and a bedroom with a window that looked out over the city and the valley below, and the rooms were well furnished without being ostentatious, which she appreciated. She had the sense they had been thought about, that someone, probably Voss, had considered what she might need and had arranged for it without either underproviding or making the provision into a performance of generosity. The court, she quickly understood, was watching her. Not all of it, and not all of it with the same quality of attention. But she had been raised in a community where social dynamics were as legible as weather patterns to anyone who bothered to learn to read them. And the court of Ashenvale was a larger and more complex version of that same fundamental structure. There were people who watched her with open curiosity. There were people who watched her with the carefully neutral assessment of individuals deciding which category she belonged in, and therefore how to interact with her. There were, as Kaylin had warned, people who watched her with something that was not quite hostility, but was related to it. A kind of appraising resistance. A suspension of acceptance that felt deliberate. The most direct version of this came from a man named Lord Davin Chryse, who was tall and silver-haired, and carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who had been powerful, long enough to have stopped noticing that they were exercising power. It had simply become the baseline condition of how they moved through the world. He came to introduce himself at the first formal dinner she attended, with the smooth social precision of someone who had been doing this for decades, and he said all the correct things about being pleased to welcome her to the capital, and hoping she was finding her quarters comfortable. And underneath all of it, in the slight angle of his chin and the particular quality of his regard, she read something that was clearer than anything he said. "You are a problem I am evaluating." She smiled at him and said the correct things back and noted him with the care she gave to things that required careful noting. She also noted the people who watched her with something warmer. There was a young woman named Lena, one of the court's administrative staff, who made it her business to find reasons to pass by Lena's study, and who eventually simply knocked and asked if she could come in and look at the somniari documents Lena was working through, because she had heard about them, and she was the kind of person who wanted to read primary sources rather than summaries. Lena liked her immediately with the low-key certainty that she liked very few people but liked them completely. There was the court healer, a broad, calm woman called Ingrid Thal, who came to look at her with a professional interest that was entirely non-predatory, and who said, after her examination, that Lena's blood signature was unlike anything she had tested, but that she found it very interesting rather than alarming, and she asked if she could compare it to some of the archived samples from before the purification, and Lena said yes, because science seemed like the right response to most things that were confusing, and there was Kaylin. He did not avoid her or keep a careful formal distance, which she had been half expecting. He moved through the court with his habitual contained intention, and she was part of the territory he moved through, present in his awareness in the same way she was coming to understand she was present in his bear's awareness, which was to say specifically, and without apparent effort. He checked in with her in the manner of someone who meant it rather than performed it, asking direct questions about what she was learning, and what she needed, and how she was finding the adjustment, and listening to the answers with that genuine quality she kept noticing. He did not ask her to have formed any opinions about anything yet. He did not pressure the timeline. She was beginning to understand, very good at holding something with care, without gripping it. The research expanded as the weeks passed, and the early winter settled over Ashenvale in layers of cold and silence, and the particular enclosed quality of mountain weather. Voss produced more documents and then more still, a remarkable archive of pre-purification material that she had apparently been assembling across several decades, motivated partly by scholarly rigor, and partly, Lena came to suspect, by something more personal. The picture that assembled itself was extraordinary in its completeness and its tragedy. The somniari had been entirely integrated into the court at the height of the old culture. Not as servants or as subordinate figures, but as partners in something that was understood to be necessary and sacred, the stabilization of the great beasts who underpinned the entire power structure of the shifter world. They had been educated, honored, given a status that sat outside the normal hierarchy, because it predated the normal hierarchy. The relationship between a great beast and its somniari had been considered one of the foundational things, one of the structures that the world was built on. And it had been dismantled in 30 years, carefully and thoroughly, by people who found that foundation inconvenient. She sat with this and felt the weight of it, not only her own story, the foundling and the missing history and the resonance in her chest, but the larger story, the centuries of absence, the great beasts slowly losing their anchors and their integration slowly degrading, the cost of that degradation, absorbed into the normal operations of the world as simple facts about how the great beasts were now, without anyone asking whether that was how they had always been or how they were supposed to be. Kaylin's bear had been losing coherence for decades, and this was considered, by Kaylin included, as simply a feature of old age. Nobody had thought to ask what had changed 400 years ago that might explain why the very oldest beasts were struggling in ways that the records showed they had not previously struggled. She brought all of this to Kaylin in the study one evening, 4 weeks after her arrival, when Voss had gone to bed early and the fire was doing most of the room's work in terms of warmth and light. She laid out the argument clearly and carefully, the way she would lay out an administrative summary, and she watched him listen to it with that quality of attention she had stopped being surprised by, taking in every piece, weighing it, following the logic. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The bear was present, as it always was now in his proximity, and she felt it in the way she felt weather, as a pressure and a warmth and a direction. "You're saying the decline I attributed to age was actually a symptom of something that was done to my bloodline 400 years before I was born," he said. "That's what the records suggest, yes. And you're saying that my court includes people who are the philosophical descendants of the coalition that did this. Some of them are more than philosophical descendants. Kreis's family was on the original coalition council." Another silence. His amber eyes were on the fire. "I knew that. I have known that for a very long time, and I have managed it as a political reality. I have told myself that what happened 400 years ago was not within my power to correct, and that the managing of its consequences was the best I could do." He looked at her. "I think I was wrong about that." She said, "Nothing." This was not a moment that needed her input. "I think," he continued slowly, "that I have been more conservative than is justified, because I have been protecting my own position and my own stability at the cost of a correction that was owed." He paused. The Somniari lineages were destroyed by a political coalition that acted within the laws of their time, while being, in any moral sense, completely without justification. Restoring what was taken is not simply good policy. It is what is owed. "There may be other surviving Somniari lines," Lena said. "If I survived through whatever accident of fate put me on that mountain road, others might have survived differently. Hidden lines, changed names." He looked at her. "You would be willing to help find them." "It seems like the correct thing to do," she said, "with my particular understanding of the situation." He nodded. And then he said, "Lena," in a way that was not the way he had been saying her name, which was with a professional precision, but in a different way, a way that had something behind it, and she felt the bear's awareness sharpen in the room the way a flame sharpens when a window closes, and the draft that was limiting it is gone. "What we are doing here, the research and the correction and the restoration, I do not want you to do it out of obligation. I do not want the anchor relationship to feel like a debt you are paying because your bloodline was entangled with mine before either of us existed." She considered him. She considered the fire and the warmth of the bear, and the 4 weeks of learning who he was through the small, consistent evidence of how he moved through the world. She considered the transposition error she had corrected before she knew any of this, the instinct toward care and precision that she had always had, that she now understood had a name and a history and a context, and which she did not disown simply because it had a context. She had chosen it. She had always chosen it. The history didn't change the choice. It just illuminated it. "I know the difference between obligation and inclination," she said. "I've been navigating that difference for 23 years. She paused. "I would like to stay." Not because I owe anything. Because this is where the work is. And I think the work matters. And I think—" She stopped, restarted, more carefully. "I think that the bear needed me before I knew it did. And I think I needed what the bear gives me, before I knew what to call it. That is not obligation. That is something else." He held her gaze for a long time, and she felt the bear settle in his chest, the way she imagined it had not settled in many years. A deep and fundamental quieting, the relief of something old and burdened finally being able to put some of what it had been carrying down. "Thank you," he said again, in that same quiet voice from the records room in Iron Peak, and this time she recognized it for what it was. Not just gratitude, though it was that. It was also the particular sound of someone who has been alone in a specific way for a very long time, and has just, for the first time, found themselves less alone in exactly that way. If you have been watching this story unfold, now is a wonderful moment to subscribe so you don't miss the rest, because everything we have built in this first half is about to be tested in ways neither of them is fully prepared for. Lord Davin Chryse moved on a frost-sharp morning in the second month of winter, and he moved with the precision of someone who had been planning for a while. It came through official channels first, which was the tell. A formal inquiry submitted to the court's administrative body, requesting clarification on the legal status of one Lena Ashford, specifically on whether a human ward of a minor clan in the Outer Territory could be housed in the capital keep under the direct patronage of the Crown without a formal designation of status, and whether the absence of such a designation constituted a legal irregularity. It was polite and entirely procedural, and absolutely designed to force either a formal declaration that elevated Lena to a recognized court position, which would require justification that would open the Somniari question to public court debate, or a formal acknowledgement that her presence was irregular, which would provide grounds for challenging it. Kaylin read the inquiry and passed it to Lena without comment. She read it, and passed it to Voss. Voss read it and said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for an opponent to commit to a move, "Good. Now we know where we stand." Lena understood then what had been built over the previous weeks. Not just her own education and the research and the growing clarity of the anchor relationship, but the documentation, the systematic and meticulous assembly of historical evidence into a coherent legal and historical argument. Voss had been doing this for years before Lena arrived, and Lena's presence had given it a human center, a living piece of evidence around which the rest could cohere. The response to Chryse's inquiry was filed 3 days later, and it was Lena who wrote the first draft. She was good at administrative documents. She was good at the architecture of a clear argument, at identifying the load-bearing elements, and making sure they were properly supported before moving to the secondary structure. She was also, she realized as she worked, good at something that she had not previously had occasion to use at this scale, the particular clarity that comes from personal knowledge of what is at stake. She was not writing about abstract history or policy. She was writing about herself, and about Kaylin, and about a 400-year absence that had been treated as inevitable, and was not inevitable, and was not acceptable, and was going to be corrected. The document was 30 pages long, and cited 47 primary sources, and contained in its final section a formal petition for the recognition of the Somniari designation as a legal status within the court framework, not as a revival of a superseded tradition, but as a correction of an illegal suppression, supported by evidence that the purification had been conducted in violation of several treaty provisions that were still technically in force. Kaylin read it and looked at her and said, "You found treaty violations. The original coalition was in too much of a hurry. They didn't think the treaties would last long enough to matter. They lasted 400 years. People underestimate the durability of written agreements." He looked at her, and the almost amusement had deepened into something more complete, something that was closer to genuine delight, the expression of a person discovering that the world contains something better than they had allowed themselves to expect. He signed the document and sent it to the court's administrative body. And then he went to speak with Chryse personally in the way that kings spoke with people who had overstepped, which was to say quietly and directly and with the particular quality of authority that needed no volume to make itself entirely clear. Kreis's objections did not disappear. That would have been too simple, and this was not a simple situation. But they were forced out of the procedural space and into the open, which was where Lena and Voss and the document had prepared for them to be. And in the open, with the full archive available, and the treaty language visible, and Lena's bloodline confirmation from Ingrid Thal's testing on the table, the objections had a great deal less to stand on than they had in the comfortable darkness of procedure. There were 3 weeks of formal proceedings. There were 2 public debates before the full court that Lena attended and participated in with the same careful architectural clarity she had brought to the document, and in which she could see on the faces of the court, not what many of them had expected. They had expected a foundling, a ward, a human woman without standing or training, uncomfortable in the formal setting, easily flustered by challenge. They got someone who had spent 23 years navigating a world that had not been built for her with a grace that looked effortless, because it was not effortless, but was genuinely hers, and who knew the primary sources better than most of the people challenging her had known. They existed. Leah brought her hot tea before the second debate and squeezed her hand and said, "You're extraordinary," with the particular warmth of someone who means it entirely and knows you need to hear it. "I'm thorough," Lena said. "Those are the same thing sometimes," said Leah. The recognition passed. Not unanimously, and not without conditions, and not without a record of dissent that would require ongoing management, but it passed. The Somniari designation was legally recognized, the historical suppression formally acknowledged as a violation, and Lena Ashford, ward of Iron Peak, was given a formal status within the court of Ashenvale that sat outside the existing hierarchy in the way the old documents described, acknowledged as necessary and specific and irreplaceable, in a way that had not been formally stated by any court in 400 years. She sat in the East Wing study afterward and looked at the official documentation with the same careful attention she had given to Kreis's original inquiry, reading the language, checking the structure, making sure the load-bearing elements were properly supported. They were. Voss had reviewed every line. It was solid. She was still reading it when Kaelin came in, and he sat across from her in the chair that had become his chair over the weeks of evening work sessions. And he looked at her with the amber gaze and the bare present, and warm at the edges of everything. And she looked back at him with the awareness of him that she had stopped trying to describe and had simply accepted as a feature of her world, this specific knowledge of exactly where he was and how he was, the way you knew the position of the sun without looking directly at it. "How are you?" he asked. "Tired," she said honestly, "and very awake. Both at the same time. That is the feeling of having done something that needed to be done," he said. "I have had it before, but not often. And not recently." She looked at the document again and then looked at him. "How is the bear?" He paused. The internal consultation happened, but it was briefer than it had been in Iron Peak. More fluid, more like conversation, and less like translation between 2 languages that only partially overlapped. "Better than it has been in years," he said. "The coherence it's better. Notably." A pause. "It is also quite certain about what it wants, which is to say, what I want, which is something I have not had to manage quite so clearly before." "What does it want?" she asked, though she knew. The resonance in her chest knew. The compass needle awareness knew. She asked because she believed in being direct about things that mattered, because she had been indirect about too many things for too long, and it had cost her, and because this was the kind of moment that should have its words said clearly and not left to be read between lines. He held her gaze. "You," he said, with the simplicity of something that had been true for long enough to have shed all its ornamentation, all the protective complexity that new truths wore while they were finding their footing, not as an anchor, not as a function, or a role, or a necessity. You, the person who corrects transposition errors before important meetings, because she cannot bear small, preventable problems to compound into larger ones. The person who writes 30-page documents that dismantle 400-year injustices, and then asks if the load-bearing elements are properly supported. The person who looked at my bear and was not afraid and asked what it needed. He paused. I have been alive for a long time. I have been alone in ways I did not recognize as loneliness, because I had nothing to compare them to. I am not making you responsible for that. I am not asking you to fix it. I am simply telling you that it is true, because you asked, and you deserve the honest answer. She was quiet for a moment, with the fire and the document, and the winter pressing against the windows and the bear warm and steady in the edges of her awareness. She thought about what she had said to him in the study weeks ago, that she had needed what the bear gave her before she knew what to call it. She thought about how she had woken up every morning in the East Wing with the knowledge of exactly where he was already present before she opened her eyes, and how she had stopped pretending that this was simply a function of the anchor relationship and not also something that she had, in her most private self, begun to want. I know what it is, she said. What I feel. I have known for a while. I have been being careful about it, because careful is what I know how to do, and because I was not certain that what I feel is fully separable from the anchor connection, and I did not want to offer you something tangled. And now, he said, now I think they are braided, not tangled, she said. The anchor and the rest of it. I think they are the same root growing two ways, and I think trying to separate them would damage both. She looked at him steadily. I choose this. You, the work, the court and the documents and the corrections and the long evenings with Voss arguing about treaty language. I choose it because I want it, not because I owe it. Is that clear? Completely, he said, and the word was very quiet. The quietness of something profoundly moved holding itself together with old practice. He reached across the study table, slowly, the deliberate slowness of someone who has thought carefully about each movement, and his hand covered hers on the document, warm and large and very steady. The bear pulsed through the contact, not pressing or overwhelming, simply present, a warmth that was old and deep, and finally settled. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that in the firelight and the winter quiet, and it was not dramatic, and it was not a grand gesture, and it was, she thought, exactly right. Do not go anywhere, because what comes next is going to show you how the world actually changes, and it is more beautiful than you might expect. The spring following was, in every record that was kept of that year, called the Year of Return. Not because of any single dramatic event, though there were several of those as well, but because of the accumulation of things coming back that had been gone. The somniary recognition, the formal acknowledgement of the historical suppression, the beginning of the search for other surviving bloodlines that Lena led with a focused, systematic attention that Voss supported with every resource at her disposal. They found 2 other lineages in the first year, one hidden in the southern reaches under a changed name, one preserved in a monastic community that had known exactly what it was harboring and had been waiting for someone to come looking. The women they found were different from each other and from Lena in almost every way, except the one way that mattered. And their great beasts, when they were introduced to their anchors, responded with the same recognition that Kalen's had, the same deep settling, the same relief of something burdened finally being allowed to put its weight down. The court shifted, not all at once, and not without resistance, because courts did not shift all at once, and the resistance was both real and, she understood, in some part legitimate, the friction of an institution being asked to change a structural understanding that had served it for 400 years. She managed the resistance with the same architectural care she brought to documents, identifying the load-bearing objections and addressing those specifically, not trying to argue away everything simultaneously, but choosing where to apply effort with the precision of someone who understood that thoroughness mattered more than speed. Kreis remained unconvinced, and she did not try to convince him. Some positions were about belief, and some were about interest, and his was about interest. And the proper response to interest-based opposition was not persuasion, but the patient erosion of the conditions that made the interest viable. She worked on those conditions steadily and without drama, and watched them erode, and said nothing about it. Leah was given a formal research position in the archive, and spent most of her time working alongside Voss, with a diligence and enthusiasm that made both women, who were not easily enthusiastic, visibly pleased. The young woman who had trailed the retinue in Iron Peak appeared at the capital the following summer in the company of her parents, who had followed the proceedings with the sharp interest of people who had always known their daughter was unusual and had been waiting to find out how. And she turned out to have a very interesting relationship with the secondary line of the Great Bear that ran through one of Kaylin's senior advisors, which led to its own months of research and its own quiet corrections. Gerald Ashford came to the capital in midsummer with the nervous energy of a man who had been carrying guilt he didn't know how to set down, and he sat across from Lena in the same East Wing study and said, "I should have done more for you. I always knew there was something specific about you, and I managed it as a complication rather than a gift. I am sorry." She looked at him and thought about what she had said to Kaylin about obligation and inclination. She thought about Doris Ashford, who had faced down a counsel for a 4-year-old in the mud. She thought about the particular complexity of being cared for imperfectly by people who were doing their best within limitations they had not chosen. "You kept me alive, and you gave me a trade, and you never made me feel like a burden even when I must have been one," she said. "What you didn't do, I don't think you knew how to do. That is different from unwillingness." He blinked hard. "Doris would have liked you," he said. "The version of you now, I mean. She always liked you, but she would have liked this version especially." "Tell me about her," Lena said. And he did, for 2 hours. And it was the most she had learned about the woman who had decided, 4 years in, that she would face down a counsel before she would send a child away, and it was one of the better 2 hours she could remember. The formal bonding ceremony between Lena and Kaylin was held in early autumn, in the great hall of the keep with the mountain visible through the high windows, and the court assembled around them with all its complexity and its contradictions and its ongoing processes of adjustment. It was not the shifter mating ceremony, which had its own protocols and its own particular significance. It was something they had designed together with Voss's help, drawing from the old records of how the Somniari and their great beasts had been formally acknowledged in the time before the purification, updated and made their own, a ceremony that recognized both what was ancient and what was new and understood that these were not in opposition. He looked at her across the space of the ceremony, and she looked back at him, and the bear was present, warm and deep and settled as it had been through all the months of work and change, and she felt the resonance in her chest that she had stopped trying to explain and had simply accepted as the truest thing she knew about herself, that she was here, that she had chosen this, that the choosing was hers completely, and she did not regret a single part of the path that had brought her to it. "I spent 23 years being a background detail," she said, not as part of any formal speech, but simply as a fact she wanted witnessed, because the ceremony was partly about witnessing and she wanted this specific thing witnessed. "I am not that anymore. I am not certain what I am instead, precisely, but I know that it is something I have chosen and something I intend to keep choosing." She paused. "That is all I have to say." There was a sound in the hall that was not applause but was something adjacent to it. The sound of a group of people who have been watching something unfold over time and have arrived at the moment where what was unfolding resolves. Not into simplicity, because nothing real resolved into simplicity, but into a clarity that felt earned. Kaylin looked at her, and the almost amusement was fully amusement now, warm and complete. The expression of a man who has found, very late, in a very long life, that the world still has the capacity to surprise him with something better than he expected. "Nor am I," he said, finally, "and if you have been with us all the way to this moment, you deserve to know how the world looked 2 years later." Epilogue. 2 years after the formal bonding ceremony, the Northern Territories held its first open assembly since before the purification, a gathering of all the great beast lines and their anchors, current and newly discovered and still being found, with representation from every major clan, and most of the minor ones. It was held in the valley below Ashenvale, in late summer, when the mountain wildflowers were at their peak, and the sky had the particular depth of blue that came before autumn. and it was both more formal and less formal than anyone had anticipated. Formal because it mattered and was being witnessed, informal because the things being said had been waiting for 4 centuries and had developed a certain impatience with protocol. Voss delivered a formal historical presentation that reduced 3 members of the assembly to tears, which she accepted with the composure of someone who had been expecting exactly that response. Ingrid Thal presented the results of 5 years of accumulated blood research that was going to fundamentally revise the academic understanding of the great beast integration, and she was visibly and uncontainably pleased about this, in a way that her usual composure had no chance against. Leah had organized the records archive into a publicly accessible collection that was already being used by researchers across 3 territories, and she sat at one of the long tables with a stack of correspondence from people who had found something in the archive that had changed their understanding of their own family history. Reading each letter with the careful attention of someone who understood that each one represented a specific person, finding their way back to something they hadn't known was missing. Gerald Ashford sat at one of the outer tables with his pipe and watched the assembly with the expression of a man who was still doing the arithmetic, but was beginning to find it adding up in a way that felt, finally, like a comfortable sum. Lena moved through the assembly in the way she had learned to move through the court over 2 years of practice. Present without performing, attending without managing, finding the specific people who needed a specific thing from her and giving it with the precision and care that she had brought to every task she had ever taken on, from dried herbs to treaty documents to the ongoing and never completed work of restoring what had been taken. She moved with the awareness of Kaelin at the center of everything, not as a constraint or a direction, but as a fixed point, the anchor's anchor, the stable reference by which she oriented herself in the complex and necessary world she had chosen. He found her at the edge of the assembly in the early afternoon, where she had stepped briefly away to look at the valley and the mountain and the blue depth of the summer sky, and he came to stand beside her with the quality of presence she had been recognizing for 2 years now, and never got tired of recognizing. "How is the bear?" she asked. He considered it. The consultation was easy now, fluid. 2 awarenesses so thoroughly integrated that asking him about the bear was like asking someone how their left hand was. Not a separate entity, but a part of the whole, present and functioning and well. Whole, he said, and the word was simple and carried everything. For the first time in as long as it can remember. Whole. She leaned her shoulder against his and looked at the valley. "Good," she said. The assembly continued below them, full of the sound of people doing the long and necessary work of correcting what was wrong and building what should have been. And the mountain was there as it had always been. And the bear was settled in. Its ancient chest, and the resonance in Lena's own chest was steady and warm, and entirely, finally, hers. And that, my friends, is where we leave them. Not at the end of anything, because this is a world that keeps going and keeps asking things of the people in it, but at the beginning of something that was earned and chosen and real. Thank you so much for spending this time with Lena and Kaelin and the Great Bear and all the complicated, beautiful work of restoration. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, please leave a like, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Until then, take care of yourselves. We will see you in the next story.